But I have realized over the years that there's not much appetite for fundamental political and governance reforms in India, whether it's the ruling dispensation in the states and the union or the other political parties across the spectrum, except for a bit of lip sympathy on occasion. Honestly, I believe at this point of time, there does not seem to be much of a appetite for real governance reform. In other words, where is the democracy working well? Where are the failings? What do we do to correct those failings? I don't think that's engaging the attention of the policymakers in the country. In that context, I'm an optimist. From an optimist, this is a depressing point I made, but that's a truthful point as I see it. Where is the silver lining? I believe the future of India is going to be shaped in the next few years by the economic management of India. Luckily, by a concomitance of circumstances, we arrived at a stage when 7% growth rate, give or take a little bit, on a sustainable basis seems to be within reach. And India is probably one of the few major countries, if not the only one, which has that possibility. China reached a fairly high level, therefore to sustain a high growth rate is difficult. And then a dictatorial and irrational regime suddenly, as opposed to what was happening in the last 30 years, has certainly undermined their short-term and medium-term prospects. For both those reasons, China probably will not be able to achieve the kind of growth rates they saw earlier. But India seems to be capable of doing it. But that we are capable, that there is potential and opportunity doesn't mean it will happen automatically. Therefore, my hope for the next year is, I'm being definitive, for the first time I'm stating something specific. The fiscal management of Indian governments, particularly at the state level, but also applies to union. If we bring a rational and acceptable approach, carefully balancing the need for individual short-term welfare measures, and they are necessary to alleviate the pain and suffering of poverty in the short term. But balance that with the long-term growth imperatives. It's not one at the cost of the other, but manage them in a manner that there's fiscal prudence. And my generation will not squander resources and borrow for you to repay without creating assets. I think it's immoral for my generation to increase the debt without the asset base. Therefore, at least have a framework in which the borrowings will not be used for current expenditure. Nationally acceptable framework across parties. I hope it will happen in the next year, because if that happens, I think we have given a reasonable basis for long-term economic security of India. If we fail to do that, I think all our wishes of wonderful new year and new generation, much of them will be unfulfilled. And alongside that, I think good education, we have now foundations in the country. And if we now pursue it in the next 2-3 years, all of us together in government and outside, to make quality education in terms of real outcomes accessible to everybody in the country, and intelligence of every child irrespective of birth is fulfilled, flowered. And education at a relatively low cost, at least bits and pieces, we can start off with a very viable, competition-based, choice-based, proper incentive-based family doctor system with proper filtering in terms of referrals, so that the mass poverty that is increasing or that sustained on account of ill health, that will disappear in a significant measure, and productivity goes up. And enhancing productivity is a very important element of economic growth. A bit of rule of law. I'm not over-ambitious. At least some elements of rule of law which are vital for economic growth. Property rights, settlement of disputes, more predictable processes in court system. Right now it's atrocious. Let's be truthful. And finally, a better understanding of urbanization, so that you don't create ghettos and urban misery and crime. You actually have graded urbanization, in situ urbanization for the relatively low skill, for the high skilled people, the bigger cities, but better managed urbanization, so that rural-urban gulf will decrease and agriculture and industry will be linked. I think these are all the realistic objectives. I have now come to a stage way beyond wishing. What is realistically possible can we deliver in the public space? If that's delivered, I'm quite content for the time being. Let me stop at that. If something much greater happens, I'll be delighted. But this much, I think, is well within our reach. I hope New Year will give us the sanity and the wisdom and the good sense collectively to make this happen. and transcend the temporary political struggles for supremacy without any outcome.